Hi, everyone. Before the episode begins, I just want to remind you to follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Marlene the Plant Lady and YouTube, Everything Gardening with Marlene Simon. And remember, please, please, please rate and review on iTunes and Spotify. That just helps the podcast get noticed by more people, and then more people will become better gardeners. And that's what we all want. So enjoy the episode.
Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. I'm your host, Marlene, and today we are going to talk about soils. The key to your garden. I always tell people before you plant anything in the ground, always look at your soil, work with your soil, figure your soil out. And of course, it's not just a one shop you're done type thing. So with me back again is one of my favorite guests, Robert Pavlis. He was my co-host for my myths because he has a two-part book series out on garden myths, and he is the go-to person for garden myths. And if you know how much I dislike a garden myth or all the information out there, you should definitely check out his site. But he also wrote an amazing book on garden soils because he's been a gardener for 40 years and he has a background in biochemistry. So together, of course, he's a perfect person to discuss soils with. So thanks for being on again.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here again.
Yeah, I must say, I really I'm picky about who I follow, picky about who I go to, but your information is so backed by research. You do the research to figure out if what people are reading online is true or not. And what's your website again? Just so we throw that out there right now.
Well, my main one is gardenmyths.com.
Yes.
And that's the one I started first, and it's got the largest amount of material on there. And boy, we cover a lot of myths there, but every day there's a new one that I add to the list.
There is. I'm sure I know my reaction when I see this stuff. I can only imagine your reaction. First of all, you might be excited by it and you're like, ooh, that's a new one. I got to write that down and talk about that. But it's probably also a little like, what are these people thinking?
Yeah, it's getting worse, I think, not better.
It is. Well, more people are gardening. More people mean they, within a year, I think people consider themselves, well, I could help my new friend. I did this last year, so it must be true. And then of course, social media where, I refuse to get on TikTok, but Instagram has enough of that where you're just like, you gotta be kidding me. So yeah.
Well, I wrote a blog post a few weeks ago, and basically the title was something like, are there any truthful memes? So a meme is this sort of a picture with a few words on it of wisdom. And it's really hard to find one of those that relates to gardening and is actually true.
And so did you find
So
any?
if you see it in a meme, you know it's a myth.
Yeah. There you go. There you go. But so, there are plenty of garden myths related to soil. So, feel free to, when we're discussing something to, I'm sure we'll hit some and then you could, sort of focus on that. But as I said in the intro, soils are important. Every gardener knows soils are important. We might have all made the mistake being new gardeners. I know I have, just wanting to plant so bad that I did not, even look to see how my soil reacts, the drainage over a year, which I think is key. I didn't figure out, well, I just assumed I had clay and that was it. And, trying to then undo mistakes when you have a garden planted can be difficult. Vegetable garden, it's easier, things die, but a perennial garden, it's tough to go back and try to amend your mistakes. But I want to start with what I think a lot of people aren't aware of. I know you've been hearing, and I know it's in your book, that soil is living. Oh, soil is living. And then you tell it really well in your book. And I should mention that your book is Soil Science for Gardening, for Gardeners. working with nature to build soil health. Um,
Right.
and you just give a breakdown of what soils are and why it's sort of important to know where your soil is originates from. So you want to hit on that?
Sure. Well, let's start with the first point there, which I don't think is important for gardeners to know, but it's a personal beef of mine. And people say soil is living, and that is wrong. Okay. Now you can think of soil as an ecosystem, right? It's a system of worms and insects and plant roots and microbes, and the whole thing is together. And there are living things in soil. But if you actually look at the definition of soil, it is not living. It doesn't eat, it doesn't breathe, it doesn't need to be fed. And it sounds like semantics, but the difference is that if you understand it's not living, you treat it differently. And I see a lot of comments online about, oh, they have to feed the soil and have to take care of the soil. And well, soil is dead. There's nothing living about it. Now, lots of things live in it, but it is not alive. Now, if you disagree with that part, well, okay, you can learn all the rest of it, and you can keep that idea in your mind. But think about soil as just dead stuff. So where does soil come from? Well, it is actually big rocks that have been slowly ground down. So soil is created over millions of years, but it starts as rocks, and they get crushed, and glaciers go over them, and wind breaks them apart, and water freezes in them, and so all these events slowly degrade that rock into smaller and smaller rocks until we have something we call soil. Now, that's important because your soil characteristics depend very much on which rocks were used to start with. So if you have granite, well, granite is kind of an acidic rock. And when that degrades, you end up with an acidic soil. On the other hand, if you have limestone, like I have here, every time I put a shovel in the ground, I'd pull up some limestone rocks. Limestone is very alkaline, and my soil is alkaline. And it's alkaline because there are still alkaline rocks in the soil. So we have some soil, but we still have rocks, and those rocks are slowly degrading. And so what is soil? Well, soil is really made up of a whole bunch of different sized rocks. Now, when they get really tiny, we call them sand. But, sand is really just a small rock. And when they get even smaller still, we call them silt. So now we have rocks that you can't actually see the particles anymore. They're so tiny. But there's really no difference between sand and silt except the size of the particle. All right, so nature comes along and we degrade the silt even more, and it gets finer and finer and finer. And now there are some chemical changes that take place, which you can sort of ignore. But now we end up with clay. So clay are extremely small particles. So if you think of the computer screen that people might be looking at, if the whole screen is a sand kernel, a piece of clay is so tiny that it wouldn't even be a dot, right? So the difference in particle size is critical there. But soil is sand, silt, and clay, and a little bit of organic matter. And that organic matter is dead organic matter. And that's soil. There's no life there. It's basically rocks. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good, I guess, it's a good breakdown of what it is. And, I have alkaline soils too. And just for people to know, that's like your pH is above 7. And I wish I had the granite because most plants prefer acidic conditions. But yeah, I definitely have alkaline soils as well.
Yeah.
And clay soils more, but all soil is made up of various compositions of sand, silt, and clay. It just then depends on what you have more of that then determines sort of the texture of your soil. Is that correct?
That's right. So if we, go down to Florida and we're on the beach there, we call that sandy soil. And if you look at it, you can see the particles. Now there might be a little bit of silt and clay in there, but it's probably 80% sand. Someone with very heavy clay might have 60% clay, and the rest is silt and sand. My soil, people still consider it clay, and it's 40% clay, which is on the high side. So there is something called the ideal soil. It's like if you could dream for the perfect garden, you would want 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. And that's sort of the perfect mix. Nobody's got that. And a gardener's job is not to try and make that. Okay, a gardener is stuck with whatever they have. All we can try and do is learn to grow on that soil and improve on it. But we don't improve it by changing the amount of sand, silt, and clay. But it is valuable to know what you have. I mean, some people will go out and look at their soil and say, oh, it's clay soil. Well, how much clay is it? And how does that compare with other people, particularly when we communicate online, right? You just said your soil was clay, and I said my soil was clay, but we might have very different amounts of clay in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is valuable to know that. And that's a little test that people can do at home. And it's a pretty simple test. I actually have a video on how to do it, but the short version is this. You take a jar, you take some soil, you put some soil in the jar, you add some water, you shake it up really, really well, and then you let it sit. And you let it sit for 1 minute. In 1 minute, all the sand settles out, and you put a little line there. Then you wait for an hour, and in that hour, the silt settles out. Right, the silt is smaller in size, but it's still pretty big, so it settles fairly quickly. So after the first hour, you've got all your silt laying there, and you put another line. Now, clay is very fine, and it can take 24 to 48 hours for it to settle. So now you wait a day until all the rest of the stuff settles, and put another line. And then you calculate your ratio of sand, silt, and clay, right? And there's a little formula that you can go through to do that. And now you have a pretty good idea what you're really dealing with. And that's why I know my soil is 40%, because I actually went through this little test. So I have a YouTube channel called Garden Fundamentals. And this actually is, I think, my most popular video is figuring out your soil texture.
I'm going to have to share this.
Jar test, right? So it goes through the calculations and so on. It shows you exactly how to do the whole thing. Now, there's another way you can do this, and you can do what's called a ribbon test. And you get some soil, you wet it a little bit, not mud wet, but moist. And then you squeeze it between your thumb and finger and see how big of a ribbon you can make. And if it's sandy, you can't make a ribbon. It just falls apart. If you have a lot of clay, you can actually form these ribbons, which are this thin strip of soil that's a couple inches long, right? Mm-hmm. The problem with that test is that you have to practice it a little bit. Yeah. So it works great if you've done it before. What I did was I actually went in different parts of my garden. In one area, I knew it was sandy. Another, it was clay, and, played with the different ones and so on. The jar test, you need no experience whatsoever. And that's why I like that test a little better.
But I do like the fact you should probably do it in various locations of your garden. And of course, not where you've just freshly laid compost. I imagine you want to go dig down 2 inches and take it from there.
Yeah, if you have a mulch, then remove the mulch and use the soil under that. If you've amended a planting hole and so on, ignore that. Yeah. You got to go to native soil where you haven't really done much to it and use that. And it is valuable to do different areas. In my garden, I'd say 80% of the property is clay, but I have this sand vein that runs through the property.
Mm.
It goes up the hill, down the other side, and right through where I put my vegetable garden.
Oh.
So I have a vegetable garden that's half clay and half sand. I didn't know that when I put it there, but over the years I
Wow.
sort of found this sand vein. And at first I thought, oh, geez, the builders must have poured a bunch of sand here, but it's quite natural. It goes through areas that have not been changed.
It's probably
So
old creek bed of some sort, I'm
yeah,
guessing.
it's an old creek bed or a lake shore or whatever, right?
Wow.
I mean, our soil has been laid down, many, many millions of years ago, and it's been moved around. And so whatever we end up with is what was there a long time ago,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, One thing I can say is that whatever your soil is, you're going to complain as a gardener, right?
That's what we
So
do. Yes.
we do. So the people who have sandy soil hate it.
Uh-huh.
And the reason, I mean, it's really easy to dig and it's really
Yeah.
easy to plant things,
Nice.
but sandy soil has very few nutrients, so you have to fertilize a lot more. It doesn't hold water, so you have to water all the time. So sandy soil is terrible soil, right? On the other end, we have clay soil. Well, it's terrible too. It stays too wet. It stays wet a long time in the spring. No drainage. You can't dig in it.
Mm-hmm.
If it does dry out, it gets hard and lumpy. I mean, it's horrible soil. But the one thing we have to keep in mind is that clay soil is the only one out of the soil mixtures that actually holds nutrients,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So clay soil is hard to dig, but at least there's food for plants. So if we improve it a little bit, we actually end up with really good soil. And if I had to choose, I'd rather have the clay than the sand. Making sand nutritious and a place plants like to grow is hard, right?
Yeah.
Unless you pick, desert plants and so on. But I'd much rather have the clay. But whatever you have, you're going to complain, right? That's just how
Yeah, it's
gardeners
just what we do.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this business of nutrients is really actually important. So we talked about the particle size,
Uh-huh.
but there's also a chemical difference. So if I look at sand and silt, chemically they're the same. Silt is really just small pieces of sand. They don't hold nutrients. They have no what we call a charge. And the charge is kind of like a little magnet on the outside. So when a nitrate molecule or a phosphate molecule or your fertilizer comes along, it just goes right past the sand particle. There's nothing to hold it there. And that's why these sandy soils are not very nutritious. The nutrients just run away. On the other hand, clay holds nutrients really well. And in fact, if you have clay, you already have lots of nutrients.
Yes.
They're tied up to that clay. So chemically, those two are very different. And that's something else we have to keep in mind is that, the clay is going to give us natural nutrients. We don't have to do anything. And we might not even have to fertilize our plants because of it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take a really sandy soil, you have to provide nutrients somehow, synthetic or organic fertilizer somehow, but sand itself has very few nutrients.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is the cation exchange capacity. So people might have heard that CEC. And, I think you explained it very nicely, basically, the difference. And I think I have clay soil. I know I have clay soils. I don't know the percentage because I haven't done the little jar test. But I've learned to appreciate my clay soils because we don't have summer irrigation. So if I soak my soils, I know that water's going to be there. I don't fertilize because I have clay soils. Doesn't mean I don't amend my soils in various ways. But yeah, sandy soils, it sounds great for the digging and the drainage,
Yeah.
but I'm much happier with my clay soils.
Yeah, I think it's the best option.
Mm-hmm.
But the bottom line is, you as a gardener, you have to learn to deal with what you have, right? You cannot change the basic texture of that soil.
So that I do want to bring up one thing you I'm sure it's adding sand to clay soils will give you a sandy loam.
Okay, well, this is a myth that I've been chasing for at least 20 years.
I figured.
Okay.
Yes.
So a lot of people will say, if you add sand to clay, you make concrete.
I've heard
Okay.
that. Yes.
Well, that's wrong because concrete has cement in it and we haven't added any cement. So that's definitely a myth. But what people mean is that if you put sand and clay together, you end up with a harder soil. You're trying to make it easier to dig, but in fact, you make it harder to dig. I'm not convinced that's true.
Okay. Yeah.
There are lots of people that say that, and I've even been told there was a study done to show it, but in 20 years, nobody's been able to find that study.
Hmm.
So theoretically, when you mix the two and you have 100% perfect mixing, you will end up with a more dense soil, and so it should be harder. That's a theoretical thing. That's where every piece of sand and every piece of clay mixes 100% perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not actually what happens. You see, what happens when you have clay soil, you dig it up and you end up with these clumps of clay, these clods of clay. And then you throw some sand in there and they coat the clumps of clay. You don't get 100% mixing. And what it does is it makes these little sand channels between the clumps of clay. And that actually is great for root growth because roots have trouble going through those hard clay clumps, but they do go through those sand channels. The other thing is that the shovel goes through easier. So I've done this now in 3 gardens in Ontario, and in every one where I've added sand and dug it into the soil, I end up with soil that's easier to dig. All right.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying that, sand in, California or New Mexico or something like that behaves the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of the reports that say that you shouldn't do this come from the Southwest of the US. And a lot of people in the Northeast add sand to their clay soil. And in Europe, particularly in England, it's a very common practice. They do it all the time with clay soil.
Interesting. Okay.
So I am not convinced you actually get harder soil. In fact, if you want to become an Adobe expert, and I'm not talking about the software here, I'm talking about blocks that you're going to use to build a house with, it's actually really critical to get the amounts of sand and clay just perfect so you end up with a good brick. Otherwise, it just falls apart. So, and there's a little more to the story, and I've written about it before, but I don't believe that myth.
Okay. All right.
If anyone listening thinks it's true, then find me a scientific study that shows that it's true, and then I want to see it.
I mean, I find it interesting that the Southwest is the only spot, and then the West too, because in California, it's, no one adds sand to their clay soils, but I think it's more because maybe the myth is more prevalent here, and no one's seen it. But the fact that they do it, you've done it, they do it in the UK, who, they've been expert gardeners there, and even back east, they do it. It makes me think, one, different types of clay, because I mean, we all know Southwest has I could just picture that clay, so maybe it's, but I don't know. It makes me want to try it.
Well, that's the other thing that we have to understand is that there are actually many different types of clay, and there are different types of sand. So if you use beach sand, which is very smooth, you might get a different result than if you use coarse sand, which is what I use builder's sand. So it's rough sand.
Yeah.
So there may be more to the story. I don't know what it is. I can only say that a lot of people do it and they don't get hard soil.
Yeah, it could be the sand where you have smooth clay and then smooth sand, and you just literally are locking. I don't know. I'm just picturing, but builder sand with more grooves in it maybe allows for a little bit more aeration. I don't know. Yeah. But good.
The one thing.
Go ahead.
The one thing that is true is adding sand to clay soil is not making it more nutritious for plants. Correct. Right? It may make it a little easier for you to dig the soil, but it doesn't do a lot for the plants.
Okay.
And the amount of sand you're adding is pretty small, so this texture isn't going to change. So if you've got 40% clay, you add a few inches of sand, you still have 40% clay. Like, you have to add a lot of sand to drastically change the amount of clay you have.
Yeah, so I guess we should say that this is not a way, if you are putting a garden in, I want to try it just for an experiment. You tried it in some parts, but that's not the best way to sort of
Yeah.
help your soil out.
Well, what I like to do is when I start a new garden, I like to put the sand in because that makes it a little easier to dig. And now that I've got it in there, from now on, I'm going to add organic matter to try and make that soil better. So it's a sort of a two-step building process to make better soil. The sand comes first, but it's not a long-term fix.
Okay. So when you say organic matter, and I know the term organic also is a big sort of, but you're basically saying organic matter as in materials that are going to help maybe build your soil up, allow it to sort of the aggregates go a little bit different, and then add nutrients, correct?
Yeah. So if we first define organic, which is completely misused by a lot of people. So there is certified organic, right? So when you go to the grocery store and buy an organic apple, that is a certified organic farming process. That's one definition. The other definition is what a chemist uses. And let me give you an example. I'm sure all your readers know about Roundup. And the active ingredient in Roundup is a chemical called glyphosate. Well, a chemist considers glyphosate organic because it's mostly made up of carbon and oxygen. So any chemical that is carbon-based is organic, okay? So that's a chemist's definition. That's not what the general public use. And then in between, we have a different definition, which is, let's call it any dead any matter that used to be living and is now dead. So this could be an apple core, banana peel, a dead plant, wood chips, kelp, fish heads, all that stuff at one point was living and is now dead, and we call that organic matter, right? Compost is organic matter. And so when I'm using the term, it's usually that third definition.
Okay. Yeah. It is misused a lot. And then everyone just always assumes organic is the best. And we don't even need to go into where because that's a whole different, because in your book, you also cover, the breakdown of, why too much compost is bad, and, or, what happens in the soil to synthetic fertilizers versus organic ones. So, but getting back to it is, that's how you build your soil and add nutrients to it.
Yeah. So we can ask another question here, and that is, okay, we've got our basic soil components, but what is good soil? I mean, what's the difference between, crappy soil and good soil? And another term I really hate is the word dirt. Okay. Dirt is the stuff on the bottom of your shoes that you drag into the house and sweep up. Okay. The stuff outside is soil. It's not dirt. But anyways, what's the difference between good soil and crappy soil? We said we can't change the sand, silt, and clay materials. We're stuck with that. Well, the big difference between crappy soil and good soil is something called aggregation. And that's a term that gardeners don't know about and don't use. And unfortunately, there isn't a simple word for it. What it means is that when you look at soil, we have these sand, silt, and clay particles. But what we really want is we want those to aggregate together, to clump together. And when we have these larger clumps, we actually have good soil. So one thing I recommend to all gardeners, no matter what their soil is like, is to go for a walk in an old forest, okay, something that's been there for 30 years, and dig around in the soil a little bit. Okay, and look at that soil and see what that soil is like. And you'll find that, first of all, it's really black, usually, but not necessarily, but it's crumbly. The soil particles are large compared to what most people have in their garden. And it's these large particles that are the aggregation. And these aggregated particles are made up of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. They're all knitted together in these larger particles. And once we have that, we have good soil. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is plant roots are actually pretty big relative to the particle sizes in soil. So they have trouble going through clay, and they have even trouble going through silt. Sand's a little easier. But they like big holes. And when we have aggregated particles, the spaces between these aggregates become really big, and roots have no trouble going through them. So roots grow really well. The other thing is, once it's aggregated, it generally releases more nutrients than soil that's not aggregated.
Oh, okay.
And there's more life in it. The reason it's aggregated is because it has a lot of microbes in there, a lot of bacteria and fungi. They're the things that actually cause the aggregation to take place, right? So now we have soil that has lots of life in it. It's got lots of spaces, which means there's lots of air. And something gardeners don't appreciate is that 25% of that soil should be air. You want lots of air spaces, and these aggregated particles allow that air to get in. So we've got the air, we got the microbes, we got lots of nutrients, water moves easily in and out of the soil, roots grow really well, and that's good soil. So that's where gardeners want to be. That's your future goal as a gardener, is to have soil like that.
And I think we've all, like you used the forest, but if you ever go to a friend's house who's been gardening in that same spot for like 20, 25 years, and you dig down into their soil, it's just, you get jealous. You're like, oh, my soil's not
Yeah,
like this.
well, the nice thing is you almost don't need a shovel.
Yeah.
Right?
Uh-huh.
In fact, my soil is about 40% clay. There was one bed when I started that was higher. It was actually pretty rotten soil. Actually, I've gardened in worse soil, but for this garden, it was a crappy bed. And it's been 17 years now. Lots of plants have been growing in there. I keep things mulched. And that soil now I can almost dig with my hands if I need to plant something new.
Oh, that's so nice.
But it takes time.
It takes
okay?
time,
This is not a 2-year process. This is a 20-year process, right? So a lot of the new gardeners out there who hear about this great soil, they go, oh, how do I get that for next month? Right? You can't.
No.
Okay. You really can't buy it, and you can't make it that quickly.
You can't,
it is a long-term struggle for gardeners to do that.
Because you're taking all that, whether it's your compost or you're just taking clippings, leaving in roots from the previous harvest, all that is the organic matter. And from that, in your book, you go in and you break down bacteria and fungi and ascomycetes, which is, if I'm not wrong, fungi, but then you go into all the microorganisms that you hear people just saying. I mean, there's the whole like, oh, you take up a spoonful and there's more microorganisms than people in 1 teaspoon of garden soil. But I don't think anyone knows what those microorganisms actually do. And so you were mentioning that bacteria and fungi are holding, is what reconfigures and forms the aggregates.
Yeah. Yeah, what most of these microbes do is they chew up organic matter. Right. So if I take a banana peel, here's another myth, by the way. The last 2 years, people have been taking these banana peels and they bury them with tomatoes because they make tomatoes grow. They put them in jars and let them sit in the sun for a couple of days and make some yellow water. Okay, all that stuff is complete nonsense. Okay, a banana peel is only a banana peel. It's a little bit of organic matter, and there's no magic about it.
Yes.
But a banana peel is organic matter. And if we throw that on the soil or we dig it in the soil, it's still a banana peel. Okay. People have this imagination that suddenly it turns into nutrients for plants. That doesn't happen. But slowly over years, that banana peel is converted to nutrients by the microbes. Okay, both bacteria and fungi slowly eat that banana peel. And they take the large molecules in that banana and slowly convert it to smaller and smaller molecules until the nitrate comes out and the phosphate comes out. And now we have nutrients that plants can actually use. Okay. And in the process, there's some news here for everyone. Microbes poop a lot and they die a lot. They grow very quickly and die. So it's this population of microbes that are living in there. They're eating, they're pooping, they're dying, they're eating each other. This whole process is going on in the soil. And that's what makes the soil better. But they need a banana peel to get this thing started because they do need some food source, and the banana is their food source, right? But it's a slow process again.
Yeah, I mean, think about your compost. Everyone wants to speed up their compost, but you can only speed it up so much because
Yeah,
it's the microbes breaking it down, and they're only going to go at their pace. Yeah, sure, if you have more
yeah,
microbes, but it's still going to be a slow process of
yeah,
breaking it down. But yeah, I love the banana. The banana makes its way around everything. The one I'm always, telling people because when they visit the conservatory, because we have staghorn ferns, is take your banana and put it in the staghorn fern. I'm like, and get some fruit flies inside. Yay.
yeah. Yeah.
um,
So here's another myth that gardeners don't understand, and the reason they don't understand it is all the experts don't seem to understand this. So we create a compost pile and we make compost. And that, you make it lots of different ways. And in fact, my next book is on compost,
oh,
but
okay.
it won't be out till the fall.
Okay.
But you can make compost a lot of different ways. You can make it faster. You can make it slower. You can make it with worms and make wormy compost and so on. They're all pretty much the same process. So we take the banana and it slowly degrades to something we call finished compost. It's black, it's crumbly. You can't see the banana peel anymore. And we consider that finished. That we think of as being very nutritious for plants, right?
Mm-hmm.
It isn't. There are almost no nutrients there for plants.
Okay.
And I've never read that almost nowhere in the gardening world. Everybody thinks this is great.
Mm-hmm.
So what gardeners do is they're growing vegetables this year and they throw in some compost and they think they fed the vegetables. They haven't. So most finished compost will decompose for another 5 years. And during that time, it slowly continues to decompose. So finished compost is only the starting point. Now, our eyes are very poor at seeing molecules. So we think it's finished. We can't see the banana peel, but chemically, there's still large particles, still large proteins there. There's carbohydrates. Plants can't use any of that. So finished compost does not feed plants. And it will over time, and it's a slow feed, which can be really good for garden plants. But it's not a very good solution for a vegetable bed where you want to grow this month and you want a quick harvest.
Okay.
And so those plants can be underfed even though you've put in a lot of compost.
But so say you add compost maybe twice, spring and fall, but then 3 years down the road, the compost from the previous 2 years might slowly now be releasing nutrients in it. But
Yeah.
but if you're starting fresh and you're only using compost, that's not good enough for your vegetables. So you should supplement, fertilize with whatever.
Yeah. And that's the real value. So yeah, people shouldn't get me wrong. I'm a big believer in that compost, in that organic matter,
Yeah.
because you're slowly building up the soil.
Mhm.
right? So next year and the year after and so on, that's when plants really get the value of it. So it is a good thing to add to the soil. It
Mhm.
just takes time to release those nutrients.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, 'cause I mean, yeah, we see it and it looks beautiful, and then you're like, "Oh, I'm gonna go put it in," or, and if you buy compost, they don't have that sitting around for 3 years and breaking down. As soon as it looks like a finished product, they're bagging it up and shipping it out.
that's right.
And then some of them, of course, you do see the soil builders and, like, the planters where they add all the sea kelp, and I know you have a whole whole section on, plants use, well, might as well segue into the plant nutrients, because there's something called macronutrients and micronutrients, and can you explain that a bit and explain I really wanna talk about the mobility of nutrients in the soil
Right.
because it's so important when you're talking about because you touched upon it with, the cation exchange and the sand
Yeah.
versus clay, why they have it, but I think a lot of people think you put fertilizers and they're all gonna be right there for the roots to take up all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we look at nutrients, so the first thing to understand is that plants use somewhere around 24 nutrients. That's what they need to live on. And there's this other myth floating around there that things like sea salt are really good for plants because they have 80 nutrients in it. Well, plants don't use those. Okay. The sea salt does have a lot of minerals, but plants don't use them. They need 24. The two biggest ones are carbon, which they get from CO2 in the air, and oxygen, which they get from water. And they have access to lots of that. So we generally don't include those as nutrients, but in fact, they are. The other macronutrients is three big ones, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And the reason we call those macronutrients is because plants need quite a bit of those to grow compared to the microbes
Mhm.
where they don't need very many. The other two macros are magnesium and calcium. So those five are your macronutrients. Now, we usually don't talk about magnesium and calcium because a lot of soil has that in it. That comes from the rocks that have been made that soil. And so we don't have to worry about that. My soil is limestone based and we got lots of calcium, magnesium there. We don't have to add it to our soil. So that's why they're usually ignored, but they are macronutrients. They're really important. And if someone's on sandy soil, for instance, you don't have enough calcium and magnesium. Excuse me, and you have to add it.
Mhm.
Um, but the big ones are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's what plants really need a lot of. And when we look at a bag of fertilizer, that's the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And the reason we put those in the bag, because that's what plants need most. So now we come to the micronutrients, and there's a whole bunch of them, and they're called things like iron, manganese, cobalt, sodium. Believe it or not, sodium, even though sodium in our table salt is toxic to plants, they do need a little bit. They
Mhm.
need a little chlorine too, but very small amounts. So the micronutrients, for the most part, you can ignore. Again, if you have any kind of clay in your soil, you probably got lots.
Yes.
If you add a little compost, you have lots. The only group that well, there's really two groups of gardeners where micronutrients are important. The first one are people who grow on really sandy soil because they don't even have the micronutrients, and you may have to add those. The second group are containers.
Yes.
So if you're either houseplants or outdoor containers, if you put a soilless mix in there, so this is something like peat moss or more popular, becoming more popular now is core. Those
Mhm.
things have zero nutrients. So then you also have to add the micronutrients, right? So those are containers and sandy soil. But the rest of us, we don't have to worry about micronutrients. We're rarely deficient in those other micronutrients,
Yeah.
particularly if you add a bit of compost every once in a while, because they'll get enough.
And I just
So
I just want to interject because there might be people screaming, but I have iron deficiency. I have, and I know we'll address the pH
yeah,
factors and this down the road. So just in case people are screaming.
yeah. Yeah, so people can have deficiencies. The only way you will know a deficiency is to have your soil tested. So this is another one of these big myths, and there's several memes out there that show you different leaves and different colorations and so on. And say, okay, if it's this color, or you have green leaves, green veins, and the leaf is yellow, it's this deficiency. Those are all nonsense. Okay, you cannot look at a plant leaf and determine the deficiency. You have to do that in a lab. Okay, so anyone who suggests that that information is not correct. Now, it does. You can look at it the other way. So if I have an iron deficiency, and I know I have an iron deficiency, I can predict what the leaves will look like. But the leaf itself is not a symptom to tell you have an iron deficiency.
Okay.
So, and most deficiencies are more pH related than actual deficiencies.
Yeah.
So those are the macro and micronutrients. And I would say if you're the average gardener, you're adding some compost, manure, some organic material, you can pretty much ignore the micros. And now you want to focus on the macros. And the macros are kind of interesting, as we think that I buy this bag of fertilizer and I spread it on the soil and my plants have those nutrients. Well, it turns out that's not true. And it turns out nitrogen is very soluble in water. So I throw it on the ground and I water it in, and it immediately starts moving through the soil profile, which means it's mostly moving down along with the water. And in fact, it moves so fast that most soil tests, particularly for gardeners, do not measure nitrogen. And you might think, well, this is crazy. Like, nitrogen is the most important nutrient for plants, and soil tests don't measure it. Why is that? Well, the reason is you go out on Monday, get your soil test, take it down to the lab on Tuesday. Even if they analyzed it right away, by Wednesday, you get the result and the nitrogen level has changed. Nitrogen levels change very rapidly. You can have lots this morning and you have a rainstorm and you have not enough in the afternoon. So nitrogen is constantly moving around in the soil, and it flows very quickly through soil. And again, it mostly runs down and away from your roots. Phosphate, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. Phosphate is not very soluble, and you put that on your soil and it doesn't go anywhere. In fact, it travels, a quarter of an inch, if that, every year through your soil.
Wow.
So the phosphate fertilizer I put on this year will reach your roots in 5 to 10 years.
Wow.
Okay,
That's crazy.
In fact, in agriculture, if they have a phosphate deficiency, what the farmers will usually do is add the fertilizer at the same time they're planting the seed, because they want the phosphate close to where the seed is going to germinate and where the roots are. There's no point putting it on top of the soil. They have to put it, beside the seed or below the seed. Okay. If you just spread it on top, you got to wait for years for it to get through. There's a second complication which has to do with chemistry, and most of that phosphate gets converted to a different form that plants can't use anyways.
Oh, interesting.
And that's one reason that plants have sort of a deficiency. So most of our soil has more phosphate than we could ever use.
Yeah.
The problem is it's in a format that plants can't use.
Got it.
Okay. Virtually no. I mean, again, sandy soil is different, but all the other soil is not phosphate deficient, even though there may not be enough for your plants. Okay. And the reason is it's not in the right format for plants. Okay. Potassium is kind of halfway between those two. So potassium is quite soluble. It moves through soil relatively quickly, but not as quickly as nitrogen. Okay. The other nice thing about clay is because clay has all these charges, clay slows down the movement of these nutrients. So nitrogen in sandy soil just goes right through, and nitrogen in clay soil will move fast, but it moves slower because the clay actually slows down the nitrogen and gives plants a chance to grab hold of it.
Can I
Okay.
can I interject and ask, it might be a lame question, but, I know nitrogen is very mobile in the soil as we were talking about. So it correlates to how fast it can move in the plant as well, right? Because there's water. It's a lot of these are moving um in the plants and water. So is it very similar? Whereas I guess it can't be though, because if phosphorus moves super slow, I guess it has to move faster in
Plant-
the plant.
Yeah. Once plants have absorbed the nutrients, they're able. They have a let's call it an advanced system to actually move these nutrients where they
Faster.
need them.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. But you actually have hit on some interesting things, which maybe get a little too complicated for today, but
Uh-huh.
it also opens up one of these myths. So inside a plant, plants move nutrients differently inside. So if I have a plant and it doesn't get enough nitrogen, what most plants will do is it will take the nitrogen from the oldest leaf
hmm
and move it up to the growing tip because that's where the nitrogen's needed.
hmm
And the old leaf goes yellow because it has less nitrogen. Photosynthesis stops in it because it doesn't have enough nitrogen, and the leaf essentially starts dying and so starts going yellow. So if you have a plant that's green on top and the oldest leaves are yellow, that could be a sign of nitrogen deficiency because the plant actually moves it to where it needs the nitrogen. Now, the interesting thing is that not all nutrients move like that.
hmm
So a leaf that has calcium, that's also one of the macronutrients, a plant can't move it from one leaf to another. Okay.
Yeah,
And so there are nutrients which are called non-mobile. Now, this is interesting because people grow tomatoes, and who doesn't grow tomatoes? A lot of people get blossom end
Yeah,
rot,
I was about
right?
to say, are we gonna address the calcium sprays? How could we not, right? How could we not address it?
Yeah.
So you brought
Well,
it up. You run with us.
it's a big myth, so we got to address it, right?
Uh-huh.
So blossom end rot is a blackening of the tip of the tomato. And everybody thinks it's a calcium deficiency in the soil. And it's possible that that's true, but it's unlikely. And so what happens is that the plant has trouble moving calcium around in the plant, and it simply doesn't move enough into the fruit. It uses it somewhere else. And the fruit has blossom end rot. Well, it turns out that calcium moves slowly, both in soil and in the plant. And if we have irregular watering, it tends to move it to leaves where it's more important than to fruit, right? If you think of it from a plant's perspective, the plant has to survive and grow. If the fruit doesn't develop properly, so what? The important thing is to keep the plant alive. And so the calcium gets directed to the plant and not enough gets to the fruit. So blossom end rot is a watering issue in most cases. Now, if your soil has very low levels of calcium, then adding some will certainly help. And the only way to know that is with a soil test, but that's rarely the problem. So, of course, now we have a whole bunch of myths. So people used to put a Tums, the antacid Tums in
Oh
the
yeah.
bottom of the hole with a
Uh-huh.
tomato. So what I like to do is to investigate these things. So one day I sat down and calculated how much calcium is in one of these Tums and how much calcium should you apply to the soil to fertilize your tomatoes. And it turns out that if you want to use Tums to do that, you have to use something like 80 Tums per plant. Okay? So yes, it will work, but one Tums is not going to do the job.
Yeah. And you're
Okay?
on a weird list, like watch list, since you've bought
Uh,
all the antacid Tums at the
oh,
grocery store.
well, this is also why people put banana peels in the bottom
Uh,
of the tomato, right? They think that it's going to cure blossom end
oh,
rot, and why they put magnesium sulfate, the Epsom salts
Oh,
mix,
yeah.
right?
Oh,
What people don't understand is magnesium is a different nutrient than
mhm.
calcium and has
Mhm.
nothing to do with blossom end rot. But they still think magnesium is going to solve this problem. And by the way, there is almost zero use of magnesium in the garden. So all the advice people see
Yes.
online is pretty much wrong.
Yes.
Um,
So
anyways,
so getting
back
back
to soil.
so just real quick, just because of the spray, so you get the spray and then all of a sudden, the next crop works and people are like, "Oh, I use the calcium spray, see it works." And like you're saying, uneven watering early in the season. But the reason why the calcium doesn't spray is it's not because it doesn't work, is because you're not liking calcium. But is it true that if you spray the calcium on the leaves, it's not moving to the fruit,
That's
correct?
that's see, that's what people don't understand. So foliar spraying does get nutrients into the plant, and it is a good way to get micronutrients in there. Like if you have a
Mhm.
copper deficiency and you need a small amount of copper in your plant,
Mhm.
foliar spraying works. Foliar spraying is almost useless for the macronutrients because plants need too much.
Got it.
But
Okay.
particularly for calcium, it doesn't make sense because if you spray it on a leaf and the
Mhm.
leaf absorbs the calcium,
Mhm.
it can't leave the leaf to get to the fruit.
Got it. Yep.
Okay.
And I know this
So,
because I read your site. So I sound so smart when I'm talking to people, and it's all really thanks to you. You do a lot of
well,
research.
thank you.
But yeah, yeah, so I just, I can't stress that to people enough, but anyways, okay, so good. We addressed some of those, but so it's true that certain nutrients are mobile, not mobile in the soil, and same thing goes sort of in the plant itself.
Yes, some nutrients are not mobile in the plant.
Okay. Okay. Um, what are other so nitrogen is highly mobile. Phosphorus isn't. Potassium, you said, is sort of middle.
Yeah.
What are some of the other ones? Because I mean, for life of me, I'm like, I always have to and I know calcium because of the blossom end rot. I tell enough people, I'm like, that's not moving. What about sulfur?
Um, sulfur has not been a problem historically because we've had a lot of pollution. We had acid rain, and
Got it.
that was sulfur. Fertilizers also had a lot of sulfur in them as
Mm-hmm.
impurities.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm reading now is that we have less pollution, so it's not dropping out of the sky anymore. And the fertilizers are becoming purer and purer and have less sulfur in there. And we're starting to see more and more sulfur deficiencies in the soil.
Interesting.
Yeah. Sulfur is an ion that doesn't stick well to clay. So it
Okay.
also tends to move through the soil fairly quickly.
Got
Yeah.
it. Okay. Interesting.
So I think sulfur's, I don't see a lot of people complaining about a sulfur deficiency, but I think going forwards, we may start seeing that. And in agriculture, they are starting to see that.
Yeah. It's on a lot of fertilizer bags more and more that I've noticed it. So I'm wondering if that's
Yes.
and I just know sulfur because, we talking about pH, who have high pH, and sulfur is one way to slowly lower the
Yeah.
pH. Um, and
Well, we can talk about pH if you'd like.
yeah, let's talk
Um,
about it because as you were saying, a lot of times you're not deficient in these nutrients. And we started out with talking about how your soil, you start out with either an acidic or alkaline based on the general makeup of your true soil. And then we're talking about how nutrients are in the soil, but sometimes they're not available. So yeah, just explain. And I know you in your book, you have the classic chart that shows the availability, that sort of the sliding scale of your pH. But yeah, sort of
yeah.
explain what happens.
Yeah, it's a little harder to explain with me waving my hands
I
and not
know.
having any
I
video,
know,
right?
I know. So I was like
Well, so plants would love to have a pH of about 6.5. And that's an average value. Okay. Some plants like to be a little more alkaline. Some plants, like rhododendrons, for instance, like to be more acidic. But most plants are quite happy at 6.5. That's what all the gardeners say. That's what all the gardening gurus say.
Mhm.
They're all wrong.
Okay.
Okay. Well, they're sort of wrong.
Okay.
The thing is that plants actually don't care what pH they're growing in.
Mhm.
Okay. What they care about is getting the nutrients that they need. And it turns out that at a pH of 6.5, they have the best access to all these nutrients. As the pH goes up or down, some of those nutrients become harder to get out of the soil. And iron is one of them. We mentioned it earlier. So at 6.5, if you buy my book and see that chart, you'll see that, there's lots of iron at 6.5. But as the pH goes above 7, there's very little iron. Now, that's not actually a true statement. What happens is that there's just as much iron in the soil, but the iron now is converted to a different type of iron, and it sticks really tightly to clay.
Okay.
So the problem is not that there's a lack of iron, but the roots can't get it. Okay, it's sort of, think of at a higher pH, the iron is hidden away from plants and they can't see it, and the roots can't get to it. And so they go, hey, I have an iron deficiency. And it shows up as intraveinal chlorosis, where the veins are green and the spaces between the veins are a more yellow color. That's an iron deficiency. So we say, the pH is wrong and we've got to lower it. And that's sort of true, right? But it's actually not the pH, it's the availability of the nutrients that's important. And some nutrients start disappearing when you get too acidic as well. So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why that 6.5 is the sweet spot.
Yeah.
As it turns out, most plants grow quite well anywhere from 5.5 to 6 to 7.5. If you're somewhere in that range, that's good enough. Okay. Now here's another secret that a lot of gardeners don't know about. I mean, if you start reading about pH, people will say, well, here's how you change it. They like 6.5. You're at 6, you're at 7. Here's how you get to 6.5. That's a really bad idea.
Yeah.
One thing you have to understand is that we can change the pH of soil, but it's difficult and it's not long lasting. Okay. So once you start changing it, you have to change it all the time. Now, if you have very acidic soil, so you're down around 5, you do want to bring that up a bit. And that's why people add lime to their soil. So but you do it annually. So it's a certain amount of lime in your soil every year, and you move the pH up and, somewhere around 6.5, and the plants grow quite well like that. Okay. Moving it down, if you have alkaline soil and making it acidic, is really difficult.
Yeah.
You can do it, and the best material for that is sulfur or sulfate. But you have to do this every year from now on, or the pH jumps right back up again.
Yeah, I don't even bother, because we're about an 8.5, and there's just no point in trying to do it.
Yeah. So as a gardener, you're much better off saying, look, this is my pH, I'm stuck with it, and I'm going to grow stuff that grows in my pH. Okay. So around here, for instance, this is something that really irks me, is all the nurseries sell blueberry plants. We have a pH of 7.5. Blueberries don't grow in 7.5. Okay, they need a very acidic soil, so they want to be down around 5. We can't make a pH of 5, so everyone goes out, buys blueberry plants, and then they get online and say, "How come my blueberry plants are not growing?" Yeah. And I have to get on there and say, "Well, because you shouldn't have bought them in the first place. The nursery shouldn't have sold them to you. They shouldn't even be in inventory in Ontario, right?"
I know. Our nurseries are loaded with them now, and then they'll try to say, well, these ones will grow in a little bit more alkaline conditions, but they usually crap out within
Yeah.
two things.
So, if you're alkaline, you don't grow rhododendrons, you don't grow blueberries, you don't try azaleas, and so on. There is a list of acid-loving plants. You don't grow those.
Yep.
And there's only 10,000 other plants that you can grow.
But we want to
Okay?
grow what we can't grow. You know
I know.
um,
And the same is on the other scale. There's some plants that really need an alkaline soil to grow. Now, if you're really acidic, putting some lime in works fairly well, and you can bring the pH up. But don't get too hung up at getting the right pH, and if at all possible, ignore it.
okay.
Now, here's another reason why you should ignore this. So there's something, again, that gardeners don't know a lot about, and this is called the rhizosphere. And they're going to learn a lot more about this in the coming years. And there's a section in my book about it, because I think it's critical. So the rhizosphere is this area right around the roots, and we're talking, a fraction of an inch. This is a very small space around roots. And this is a fantastic place. It's different than anywhere else in the soil. And plants condition that space to suit themselves. So they actually attract the right kind of microbes to live right next to the roots. And they get benefits from that. And that's another whole story.
Yeah.
But the other thing that they do is they adjust the pH. So the pH in the soil might be 7.5, but the pH in the rhizosphere, which is the part that plants really care about, couldn't be 2 pH units lower.
Wow.
So it could be a 5.5.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
So my soil, when I measure it, is a 7.5, but my roots are in effect growing in a 5.5 because my plants condition it that way.
Wow.
Okay. So why am I worried about lowering the pH? The plants are going to do that on their own. And not only that, but each plant conditions it to the pH that they like.
To a certain extent, though. I mean, because we just said we can't grow blueberries.
Yeah. There is a limit.
Yeah.
Right.
There
There is a limit.
Yeah.
And the thing that I suspect, see, scientists are still learning about this rhizosphere, but I suspect what will happen is that we'll out that blueberry plants are not as good at controlling this pH around their roots as other plants.
Okay.
Right? Or blueberry plants are not very efficient at finding iron. Okay. So one of those two things, I think we'll figure out and then say, okay, this is why blueberry plants can't grow here, because they're not very good at finding iron, and there isn't enough unless it's really acidic.
And then here, this also goes in because they're Ericaceae families, and I believe a lot of Ericaceae families have a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizae. So it's sort of the same idea as they attract things around them to help them. So it's very possible if you don't have the proper strain or the pH is too high for that mycorrhizal strain, and that's the mycorrhizal is maybe what's sourcing getting the available iron. So I mean, there's so much more that we're just starting to learn about the relationships between all these fungal bodies and stuff. So I don't know. I'm pretty sure Ericaceae has a lot of symbiosis with mycorrhizae. I could just made that up right here, but I don't think so.
Well, that could well be. I mean, 80% of the plants make associations with fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi, right? And the thing I found most fascinating is that it's the plants that decide if they're going to make the association. It's not the fungi. The fungi basically sit around and say, I hope this plant root wants me and wants to date me. And then the plant root comes along and actually excretes certain chemicals that signal the fungi as, okay, it's dating time. Now I can connect to the root.
It's crazy.
So it's the plant that's in control of all of this, which I think is the most fascinating part of this.
Yeah. And
one other thing I have to say, when I say control, I'm not talking about that the plant has any kind of mental knowledge of this. Okay. There is no intelligence in a plant. This is all biochemistry driven.
Yeah, you
which
got
is
to
another one
clarify
of
that.
my.
I don't want to keep you too long. There's few things I want to touch upon just because I think I have the most basic understanding of it. But gypsum, it's a myth. It softens the soil. And if I'm correct, is that what it does is it briefly changes what does it do? It puts salt almost into a mobile form so when it rains heavy, it will leach out salt. So
Yeah.
therefore it basically is getting rid of salts and that's about all it does, correct?
Yeah, so this is a big myth too. So anyone with clay soil is told that if they put some gypsum on their soil, they loosen up the
Mhm.
clay.
Mhm.
Okay. And that is both true and false. So if you have sodic soil, which is clay soil with a lot of salt in it, gypsum will help. And it does exactly what you say. The gypsum replaces the sodium ions on the clay, and the sodium ions can now be washed away with rain. You lower the salt amount, and the clay becomes looser.
Okay. Okay. That's what you still
But
see.
if you don't have sodic soil, the gypsum does nothing to clay.
Yeah, and they use it around the orchards around me, but I think it's because our water has a lot of boron, which is a salt. And if
Yeah.
they add most fertilizers are salts, like we're talking about.
Yeah.
So they're trying to. Plus, I think it's sort of old school where they're like, "This is what we've done every year." But I mean, there is a practical um, use for it. It's just
Yeah.
it used to be add it to your clay soils before you plant, and your soil will turn into
Yeah.
quote soft. And I've never understood what soft really meant,
Yeah.
but okay, I just wanted to make sure that I was
Yeah.
getting the
No-
basic principles of that correct.
Yeah. Now, sodic soil, I'm pretty sure, only applies to sodium.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Interesting.
So sodic so a soil that's along the coastline, for instance, or in certain areas that has a lot of sodium in the soil is
Hmm.
sodic.
Okay. So it
Uh,
wouldn't be for boron then.
Well, maybe it also works for boron, and
Yeah.
people just don't talk about it,
Yeah.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Because I'm in the
but
Central Valley of California. We're far enough away
yeah,
from the ocean, but it's our boron's really, really high.
yeah. Well, you can find a lot of sodium even in the Midwest. It's
Okay.
left over from millions of years
Yeah.
ago when there was
Yeah.
salt water in certain areas. So,
Okay.
but as a general rule, gypsum does not help clay soil.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Good. You heard it here, everyone. Even though I've been telling people, you've heard it here. Um, I do want to talk about I love your book because you do address the myths in each portion, and you also give the tests like we're talking about, the ribbon test and the bottle test, but you also have one, the tidy whitey test.
Yes.
It's fun.
So,
People love fun stuff, you know?
yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, it's kind of when you read about it, you think, oh, this is kind of like a joke. It actually works.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing.
Uh-huh.
So if we go back to what good soil is soil that has a lot of microbe activity in it. So a smart person might ask, well, how do I know how many microbes I have? Right. And if you get online, you might find some videos which will tell you to go out and buy a microscope and a course to identify microbes. Please don't do that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's another one of those myths. But it is a valid question. How many microbes do I have? And if over the years I'm going to improve this, how do I measure that I have more? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's really hard to do that. Particularly for a gardener. Now, if you're a scientist and so on, there are some things you can do. But as a gardener, we only have a couple ways to measure microbes, and they're indirect methods. So one of them is to count dew worms. More dew worms, you have more microbes. Dew worms, and I'm sorry, I use the word dew worms. I
Yeah.
actually mean earthworms.
Okay.
Earthworms eat microbes. and you have more microbes, you have more worms. So that's one way. And there is a method described in the book where you actually take a certain amount of soil and you dig it up and you literally count worms. There's another one, and this is this tidy-whitey test. So what you do is you take some cotton underwear, and it has to be cotton. Okay, no nylon stuff and none of these fancy cloths. It has to be cotton. Remember, cotton is an organic material. It's plant material. And you bury it in the soil. And then you wait. And I can't remember if it's a week or 2 weeks. And then you dig it up. And the amount of decomposition of that cotton is relative to the number of microbes you have in the soil. And there are a number of university courses where they actually go through and do this test because it works. They'll go out to fields that have different number of microbes and bury these things and bring them up after a certain period of time. And you can literally see where the microbes are, because microbes decompose organic matter. So they're going to decompose these underwear.
I don't know why
So-
I'm shocked or laughing. I listened to a podcast where it's called like the Texas Body Farm, where it's this big field out in Texas where they literally have dead bodies out exposed, some partly buried, just so the forensics could be determined. So I mean,
Yeah, well, it's organic matter, right?
yeah. So I should tell
it-
people don't bury bodies though and do this.
Preferably, underwear are a lot easier. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so you should have it degraded down within a
Yeah.
couple weeks. So
Yeah, and in fact, you can take cotton and put it in your compost pile. It will decompose. It decomposes rather slowly compared to the other stuff that you put in there. So I don't really recommend it. And who's got big piles of underwear laying around? But people put in old blue jeans and so on. They will all decompose in a compost pile.
Yeah, if it's natural materials, you would expect that too. Well, I could keep you forever talking about soils and we talked more about, nutrients and soils and just how all this goes together. And I think this is really, I'm so intrigued just listening to you talk about this, and I'm sure it was super educational. So I'll have to have you back and we'll talk about it. But your new book's coming out and it's on composting. It's coming out in the fall.
Well, sort of.
Sort of. Okay.
My new book is already out, and it's actually called Plant Science for Gardeners.
Oh, how did I not know that? Okay.
And it goes through, and it's sort of a cross between a gardening book and a botany book. And we look at and try and understand the science of plants. How do leaves form? How do plants get bigger? And then we look at weird things like, does the sunflower head actually follow the sun, and why does that happen, and how does it happen, which is even more interesting. So Plant Science for Gardeners is out.
Okay.
It's available certainly as an ebook and as a printed book, and will be out as an audiobook at some point.
Okay.
And my newest one, which is at the editors and should be released sometime this fall, is Compost Science for Gardeners.
Okay. Wow.
And it goes through all of the composting techniques, bokashi, vermicomposting, various types of traditional composting. And again, looks at how you do it on both some of the science background and why you do it, and how these various techniques compare, which one makes better compost, which one makes faster compost, and so on. And so that should be out this fall. There's a bit of a slowdown on one part of it, but I think will still be released by this fall.
And when are you starting your podcast?
I am not doing a podcast.
Good, because you could just be on mine then a lot.
I will come on anytime you want.
Okay.
I have a YouTube channel called Garden Fundamentals. I have a blog called Garden Fundamentals, and I have a blog called Garden Myths,
Yes.
and that keeps me more than busy. And in fact, we also have a Facebook group called Garden Fundamentals.
Yes, and I'm on that, and I love it because so many people just
It's
one, they want brownie points from you when they throw out and post like a bad myth. You could just see that. They're like, "Oh, I'm gonna get points for Robert seeing this one." But yeah, people get mad.
yeah,
People get mad like I do, and I'm like, "What are they talking about?"
yeah.
So,
Yeah, the difference between our group and others is that if you post some nonsense, you will know it. We don't put up with a lot of myths. I mean, you're welcome. You're welcome to post anything controversial and give us some references, and we'll look
uh-huh.
at the references. Nothing wrong with
But
that.
it's done in a
Um,
I will say it's done in a nice way. I will say a few times, like, you're just so to the point because you're coming at this, like, from a science, to gardeners that I think 1 or 2 times it was hilarious that people were just like, "Oh, how did he speak to me like that?" And I'm like, "He didn't. He was telling you how it is." So it's just so
you know,
funny.
I'm sure there's some people who think I'm rude,
N
and
I mean, roll with that.
but but you see, those people didn't read my blog. If they had read the blog first,
I
then they wouldn't have
know.
posted some of these ideas. So
Well, and that's what I wanna that is constantly what I feel like every single time I'm like, this was addressed in the book, this was addressed on the blog." I mean, your blog is amazing. It's gardenmyths.com. I mean, and then you have it's a 2-book series on it, and I mean, I guess you're never ever gonna run out of myths because thank goodness for social media, they're just supplying you with new ones. I can't even keep up with
yeah.
certain ones, and yes, there's gotta be a 3rd book coming out soon.
Well, there's too many books coming out. Yeah, when I started Garden Myths, I thought, I'm sure I can find 100 myths to write
Mhm.
about,
Mhm.
and that'll keep me busy for a year or two, and then I'll go do something else. At the end of the 100 myths, I had a file of another 300 to write up, and
Crazy.
right now, I've done almost 400, I think, and I have 160 some started but not finished.
Wow. Wow. There's a lot of
So
books
I
out
do
there.
not run out of material.
No, no, and, I like it that you're even, I mean, just like we were talking about the sand to the clay, and it's like I've always heard it, and I've always tried to scientifically say why, but it's true. A lot of times you hear these things, and whether we know they're true or not, then you try to go find the science, and you're like, "Well, there's not a lot because I'm trying to back up when I tell people,
Yeah.
the this and this because you can't, you're just as bad as the myth if you're just like, "No, you're wrong." Why?
Yeah.
Because I say so. So,
Now, a lot of people think, that I come at this with a formed opinion, and I probably do have an opinion when I start, but
mhm,
a lot of times when I do the research, it changes that opinion. So I did one recently on tilling. I mean,
mm,
if you had interviewed me a year ago, I would have told all your listeners, don't till, it's bad for the soil.
mhm.
So I actually looked into it, and it's still not a great thing for soil, but it's not nearly as bad as we think it is.
Interesting.
There's a lot of myths around tilling,
Yeah.
and the amount of carbon that is lost from the soil and so on. It turns out you lose it from the top couple inches, but you actually gain it in the bottom layers.
Oh,
So when we look at the foot of soil, there's no loss in carbon when you till,
hmm,
which
okay.
really surprised me. But when I go to research it, that's what I found, and that's what I write.
Okay, so I
So
imagine that one's on your gardenmyths.com blog?
yeah,
Okay,
it's a couple of months old,
okay.
maybe two to 3 months ago. Um, but that one really surprised me. As I said,
Yeah,
6 months ago, I would have told you tilling is just terrible. In fact, I've been telling people for years, don't till; it's
hmm,
bad for soil.
okay.
I think
Yeah.
there's better ways to do it for backyard gardeners, but in agriculture, it doesn't look like tilling is nearly as bad as we thought it was.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this is the critical thing. We always have to go back to the science.
Mhm.
And some of this tilling science is fairly recent science. So 15 years ago, the scientists also said tilling was bad, but they've done some more deeper tests. They've gone down a foot in soil and done the tests there and said, hey, just a minute, we're surprised with the results,
Hmm.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so it's critical that we go back to the science and no matter what you think be open to the science,
Or new
right?
studies and which is the science.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So,
the one that's up right now is about monarch butterflies, right? We've known for several years that they're dying off.
mhm.
And the latest study says, no, that's not necessarily true. That the populations in the northern part, the summer populations, are as large as they've ever been.
They're just not migrating
They're
or
not migrating, and they do see the populations in their nesting locations in Mexico and California are down.
but the
But by the
overall numbers.
time they build up, see, the one point they made is that a female can lay 500 eggs. So they make up populations quickly,
Got
and
it.
so on. I think some of that science is still going to float around, and we're going to revisit it.
Yeah.
But we have to be open to that science and look at it and say, okay, well, maybe what we thought was true isn't true, and the science from 15 years ago may have been wrong, and we have new science now, and that irritates people. It says, well, why aren't they right? But the whole point of the science process is it's an iterative process. We continually re-examine what we think we know and improve on that knowledge. And that's the beauty of science.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, go into it. I'm just going to say, some of them you did the ice cream cone one, and that one was just blatantly just stupid and obvious. And you didn't need any scientific papers. But, don't take things at face value when people say things, and definitely just don't believe it if it's on the internet or, like you said, in a meme. So,
if it's in a meme,
if it's in a
and
meme,
if it's in 90% of the YouTube channels,
yeah.
don't believe it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, your YouTube channel has the video on how to do the figure out what kind of soil you have, and that's Garden Fundamentals on
Yeah,
YouTube.
if somebody, if somebody Googles garden fundamentals and puts in soil texture, they'll find it.
Okay. And maybe I'll share it on my Facebook just to get people there when I post this. So, but I'll definitely have to have you on about that the plant science botany, because I've been actually wanting to do basic botany. Um or basic, not like to overwhelm people with all the, stuff they don't need. But, gardeners really need to know the basics of how plants grow. And,
Yeah.
but that would be fun to have you on. So we'll plan that down the road. And then,
Sure.
yeah. So, thanks again. So everyone check out all of his sites and his book. Of course, we talked about soils. This book was Soil Science for Gardeners Working with Nature to Build Soil Health, which is true. So until next time, everyone, happy gardening.